So thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll just kind of whiz through the agenda, but for those of you who are new here, we'll introduce ourselves, introduce Prodo very quickly, and if you wouldn't mind staying unmuted for now, that'd be great, as we do record and post these sessions later on. But if you do have questions as we go through, please feel free to pop them in the chat. My colleagues will be dropping some links in there into the chat pane too, so look out for those. And we'll of course go through the main topic of today, and then at the end we've saved some time for some Q&As, so please keep those questions ready to ask either us or our guest speaker today. So we'll get cracking. So obviously on today's session you'll notice there's a bit of a switch up today. If you're a familiar attendee of the Hive, you know that we are not Jacob. He is currently attending an off-site meeting, exploring the art of the possible with a lovely housing association in the south. So we've jumped in to fill his place today. So I've also got my colleagues Joanne, Bobby and Claire on the call. So Jo, if you just want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone, nice to see you all. So I'm Jo Wilson, I'm a senior account manager here at Prodo, and I've been working alongside Liv and the rest of the client services team with our housing association clients for about the past 3 years now. And yeah, I've had lots of discussions recently with our housing clients about the new proposed policies. So really looking forward to today's sessions and from hearing from Rachel.
Perfect. So if you're new to Prodo, we specialised in the housing sector for over 20 years, working with hundreds of housing associations in that time. We're also the authors of Shift, a book focusing on making channel shift happen within the sector, and we're in the process of writing the second edition, which is going to focus on the vast pre and post-pandemic shifts we've seen within the sector. So keep an eye out for that. We're also the minds behind the Prodo portal, the UK's first SaaS portal and native mobile application.
Thanks, everyone. So yeah, I mean, there are countless ways that digital transformation can help to support these proposed policy changes. So for example, digital platforms for tenant-landlord interactions. So obviously with all of these new regulations coming in, digital tools can help to streamline tenant rights enforcement, help manage rental agreements and handle dispute resolution more efficiently. We've also been looking, obviously, at data-driven property management. So with the use of data analytics, then platforms can ensure compliance with rent regulations, also monitor market trends, and then identify gaps in social housing, which obviously can help local authorities better allocate resources for building new homes and maintaining existing ones. And then we've been looking at smart housing solutions. So technology like smart home monitoring systems can help improve housing quality by tracking conditions in real time, which is particularly useful in social housing to identify maintenance needs before they become critical issues, which, as we know, is something that we are all keen to get a handle on within the sector. And then digital inclusion for tenants. It's really important that the government focuses on renters' rights right now, which we know is one of the proposed policies. So ensuring digital access is crucial, and digital literacy programs or simplified online portals, such as the solution that we here at Prodo have developed, really do help tenants, especially those in social housing, and helps them with better access services, applying for housing benefits or searching for affordable homes. Liv?
Thanks, Jo. So a couple more things to mention in terms of that digital transformation piece. So in terms of tenant data and predictive analytics, so with Labour's focus on renters' rights, digital transformation can help leverage predictive analytics. I find that really interesting topic that's been discussed quite a lot at recent events that I've attended. But it's all about preemptively addressing issues such as rental arrears or tenant vulnerability. And by using that data, housing associations or local councils can identify tenants who may need early intervention due to financial distress, allowing for support measures before issues escalate. AI-powered algorithms could also predict tenant risk factors and ensure proactive engagement. And then things like digital platforms for housing accessibility. So I guess we'll hear more about this from Rachel, but Labour is likely to be focusing on making housing more accessible to vulnerable groups such as the elderly or those with disabilities. And it's with digital tools that we can support this by integrating assistive technologies into the social housing space and within the homes themselves. So smart home systems that adjust temperature, lighting, appliances for disabled residents, for example. Additionally, digital portals can simplify the application process for adapted homes and specific housing programmes aimed at vulnerable groups. And we've got tenant-led digital platforms. So given Labour's commitment to empowering tenants, we can do co-designed digital platforms, which we're really big on here at Prodo in terms of using tenants to shed light on what tenants actually need and want from us. So co-designed digital platforms can give tenants a greater voice, and these platforms can allow tenants to participate in the decision-making process, reporting issues and suggesting improvements to their housing conditions as well. They could also serve as a channel for tenants to organise and advocate for their rights, with features like digital voting, community decisions, or direct communication with housing providers. So a nice example of this is our mobile app for tenants in social housing that allow them to raise repairs, track issues, and access key documents in a secure environment. And finally, we looked at kind of improving tenant engagement through digital channels. And I know that we've done housing hives on this in the past as well. So if you want to go and have a look at those, there's a bit more information. But we think that digital communication tools like chatbots, mobile apps, and web portals can really enhance engagement between the housing providers and their tenants, especially, I guess, in the context of this hive, between in a post-Labour world where tenants' rights are a key priority. Providing digital channels where tenants can lodge complaints, pay rent, and track the status of issues can improve transparency and reduce admin burdens. So Labour's proposed changes will likely require greater interaction between those housing providers and their tenants, and these digital platforms can make the process smoother and more transparent. So, for example, using an app, we can have built-in complaint logging, rent payment features, and could streamline interactions and compliance with the new regulation. So it's a kind of nice few examples there of how we can use digital transformation to support these policies. But I believe we have Rachael with us now. So Rachael, we did a bit of a switch on the agenda, so we have gone through our digital slides, but we're going to go back to your slides now, and we look forward to hearing you. But we'll start by letting you introduce yourself, if that's okay.
Great, thank you. And yeah, sorry I was late. Nothing like being down to speak at a meeting that you don't obviously have the link for. So got here in the end. But nice, it's so nice to see everyone. I can't really see people because people have got cameras off, but I assume you're out there. Thanks for inviting me along. Yeah, I'm head of policy and external affairs at the Chartered Institute of Housing, and I came to one of these a while back to talk about some of the work we were doing and with the sector on cost of living. So I've been asked to just give a bit of an overview of where are we at with the new government, and it sounds like you've done a really helpful kind of set of links there. So I hope I won't repeat too much of what you might have already said. I won't speak for too long, keep it kind of reasonably high level, and then make sure there's time there for questions, which I know is always the helpful bit. So yeah, happy just to move into the next slide. I thought before getting into what's the government said, we'd just remind ourselves of where we're starting from, why we're talking about housing. And I've just come from the Labour Party conference, which finished yesterday, where there was loads and loads of really good discussions happening in the housing space, and not surprising when we just remind ourselves of some of the statistics. So these will be familiar to you, but just how difficult things have got for so many people, so many people that don't have a safe, secure home, increasing numbers of people, including children, living in what's called temporary accommodation, which is often just a room in a hotel or B&B, could be a hostel with very limited facilities, not necessarily anywhere to cook. Obviously, huge impact that has on people's life chances, and it really is as bad as it sounds for a lot of people, and so not surprising it's making the headlines. And of course, for councils, it's really tipping some of them into risk of bankruptcy because of the duty they have in the most extreme cases if someone finds themselves homeless, to help people have at least a roof over their head. So really, really difficult starting place. And then not surprising that government has gone really big on housing in its kind of initial set of speeches and announcements, and we'll come on to that. So next slide, please. And before we hear from what the government has committed to or hinted at, I just thought I'd summarise some of the asks that we made in the manifesto. Sounds a bit grand, doesn't it? But we published a 10-point plan and a strategy for housing about a year ago, so before the election was called, where we just tried to set out in really simple terms what do we think needs to happen. And it's great to see actually the new Labour government committing to a lot of this already. So we've said, and this is a theme running through a lot of the conversations we were having at the Labour conference, yes, we need to increase supply, and government's obviously made some really welcome noises around that, but we also need to make sure that existing homes are looked after, and we need to keep the two in balance, because in the past when we've run off to do development, we've seen the investment in quality drop off, and this is all part of difficult decisions providers are making. So we've got to keep the two in balance. So that's just a summary, and there's links that will be available, I think, afterwards if people want to have a look. But yeah, next slide's great. So here's our new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and of course I can't resist the temptation to put a picture of him in front of one of our podiums, because we had him come and speak to a session we had in February before he became Prime Minister, and they went really big on really changing the face of housing, in their words, which they are clearly trying to do. And 5 years isn't long in a parliamentary term. July, when they won the election, seems like a while ago, if nothing else, because of the change of weather. But actually, it takes time to do some of what they're looking to do. And a few people described it over the last few days as like trying to turn an oil tanker, because system change takes time. But they've set out these missions for a better Britain. Housing wasn't one a specific mission, and some people wondered why that was, but actually when you read them, housing really runs all the way through. So if we're going to make people's lives feel better, if at the end of Labour's 5-year term in Parliament, people are going to be deciding who they're going to vote for, are things going to feel better? And without getting into the politics, there's obviously a bit of expectation management happening at the moment. There's a lot of starting with what the government's inherited from its predecessors, and a bit of building back, and hence that sort of, it's going to get perhaps harder before it gets better, but very much a new focus and a new vision. So we'll unpack that a little bit if we can move to the next slide.
Thanks, Rachel. Before we move on,
oh sorry, you've got some questions maybe.
Yeah, no, that's fine, Rachel. Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, it's really, really good and positive to hear that the new government does have this new focus, on something that's clearly needed. But I'd be interested to get your perspective on what sort of long-term structural changes within the housing sector do you anticipate under a Labour government, and how can housing associations be preparing for these changes?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, actually, even before the change of government, if people haven't clocked it, there was already a lot of big change coming. So that new proactive consumer regulation, which I'm sure you'll have been talking about in these sessions, is the thing that's having a massive impact. And I was at a session yesterday that we ran where we had someone from the Regulator of Social Housing come along and talk about some of those early findings from their reports and their casework as providers just get to grips with what that new world means in practice. And so much of that is generating, thinking in organisations around system change. So everything from data, how do you understand what properties you've got, the state of them, understanding who lives in them, where there might be additional needs. You hinted already about accessibility. That's going to be a massive one. So understanding your homes, and we did something called Better Social Housing Review with National Housing Federation a couple of years ago, which we've been spending a lot of time talking about in the sector. I don't know whether that's come into one of these sessions, but there was a recommendation in there around knowing your homes, and there's some work that actually just been starting to be trailed this morning, if anyone's seen any of the housing trade press around this new initiative that National Housing Federation and RICS, Chartered Surveyors, are kicking off around stock condition surveys. So I think probably for some of the people on the call, that will be really interesting to see what comes of that. So it's easy to say, isn't it, you need to know your homes, but what does that look and feel like in practice? So how often and how and who do you get out into homes, and obviously there's access issues maybe around that, to understand all the things that need to be kind of fed into the system, so to speak, so you've got an understanding of where you need to do kind of regular maintenance work versus emergency repair. And then the new government has committed to, and just in the last few days confirmed, that it will continue some of the stuff the previous government had initiated around Arab's Law, which I'm sure people will have heard talked about a fair bit. So responding to hazards, and that was initially set up for the social housing sector, but that's extending now into the private rented sector, and there'll be a power in the Renters' Rights Bill to do that. So for organisations thinking about structural changes, it's going to be a really big focus, or even more of a focus, on knowing your homes, knowing the people living in them, and thinking about how you triangulate that data. So data is something I know we've been talking about in the sector for a long time. That's just going to continue to be a really big conversation. How do you make sure you've then got the assurance to demonstrate, as and when the regulator comes and does an inspection, whether that's a reactive or not, to say, well, look, show us how you understand what you've got, where your challenges, where your pressures are, how are you engaging with residents, how are you responding to complaints, how is all this stuff getting logged in the system, what do you do with that information? So I think it's not going to be a massive change of direction from what we had before, because that had already started, and hopefully the government's wanted to continue with it, but I think there's going to be a greater focus, and that's for private rented and for social.
That's great. I think it's quite a conversation that we've been talking about a lot in terms of knowing your home, knowing your tenants, and kind of the way that digital solutions can support that, even from things like kind of that predictive AI, repairs and kind of seasonal repairs, and what we can kind of expect and how we can preempt problems in those sectors, in those areas as well. So that's a really insightful. Thank you for that, Rachel.
Thank you.
So this is a summary of some of the big housing pledges that the government have announced, and hopefully you'll be familiar with them. So housing targets is the big one, because before, I know the previous government would say we had them, but they didn't really mean anything in any kind of legal sense. So now we're talking about every area having to have a local plan, housing targets that sort of set at a national level that then will be worked through a methodology which is to be determined, because they've just recently consulted on some of this stuff. But basically every area having to have a housing target based on an assessment of local need, and that's current need and a sense of future based on what you can see around demographic projections. So we'll have to see what comes out of the consultation that's recently closed on the National Planning Policy Framework. But a lot of stuff around planning reform, people have probably heard there's been a big focus on that. And one of the things I suppose we're finding ourselves saying a bit more recently is that it's good, the planning reform stuff is needed, but it's doing a lot of heavy lifting. You can't do it on its own. And you'll have seen, I'm sure, a lot of calls across the sector for more money. Ultimately, you can't get all the kind of level of house building happening, this 1.5 million over the next 5 years, without more money going into it. And the only and last time we got anywhere near to building on the scale that the government has said it wants to do is like back in the 1970s, when councils were playing a massive role and government was putting a lot of money in, freeing up the land and the sort of policy framework to support it. So it was a big debate, you can imagine, at Labour Party conference for those who were talking about, so how does this work in practice? Massive issues around the capacity in the sector to do it as well when you think about construction. But within weeks, I think it was the 30th of July, there was the announcement to get moving with all of this stuff. So very quick and very encouraging. And the very first speech that we had from the Chancellor, the first female Chancellor, had housing as a driver for growth at the heart of it. So when we talk about growth, I guess from the CIH perspective, we're really keen to stress it's inclusive growth. We're not just talking about economic growth. There's so many things, that benefits that come, as I'm sure people will know, from social house building, for example. I think it's the status for every £1 invested, it's something like £2.81 effectively in GDP that's generated. So it's good for the economy, but obviously it's good for people who are currently not living in safe, secure homes. But that all takes time. A number of things they've announced around, helping to unblock stalled sites where maybe the land, the permission's there to build on, but it's not got moving. So helping to unblock that. You'll have heard about new towns, and there's a new task force that's been set up, and we'll find out more by the end of the year, I think, on where those new towns are going to be. All sorts of other things like changing compulsory purchase orders, so councils have a much bigger role in identifying where development needs to happen and going in and helping to make that happen. This is all going to get tested, of course, some of this in the court. So there's the sort of the theory and the practice, and time will tell how it plays out, but a much bigger focus on social housing. So Labour has also very clearly talked about wanting to boost affordable home ownership, reforming private renting. They're looking cross tenure, but a really big focus on social housing. And the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, who has the lead for the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, has talked about wanting to kickstart a council housing revolution. So recent times we've been focusing much more generally on housing associations doing the development. Here there's going to be a much bigger role, as there needs to be, for council housing, and housing associations and councils are going to have to really work in partnership to help deliver on these numbers.
Yeah, so I guess a question from us is, in terms of that role, what role do CIH see for those housing associations and local councils? You've said kind of working together, but how do you think these organisations can better align with those government's housing goals?
So I think one of the themes that's been really coming through is partnership. So no one sector organisation kind of can do this on their own, and certainly where there's some really good examples of working in partnership, joint ventures, early engagement to identify where development needs to happen, understand the kind of properties that need to come forward, and then making sure that quality homes are being produced at the other end, because there is, it's not all about the numbers, as we've probably seen. There's been coverage in the media about poor quality homes coming through, lots of snagging and defects. So making sure that it's, yes, more supply, but it's got to be the right homes in the right places that people can afford, that are good quality, that stand the test of time. So working in partnership, and within that, there's quite a lot of challenge for the sector to do in a constructive way back into government, to make sure that the regulatory framework is there to enable this. So, you know, the rules need to be there that set the clear standards for the kind of homes we should be building. So previous government consulted on the future home standard. This government now needs to confirm what's going to happen next. It said at the party conference the other day that they were definitely going to be moving forward with the decent home standard, the sort of updated version, but there needs to be a consultation on what that's all going to look like in practice, because of course housing providers need to know where the money's coming from for this, what a rent's going to be paying for versus what money might government be sharing through grants, and where there might be scope to work with private partners. So partnership is the buzzword, I think. And then I think within all of that is just making sure that people work together to keep making sure that, yes, it's more homes, but it's, as I said, the right ones with good eye on quality. And that's one of the things that from a CIH perspective, with a big focus on professionalism, we're really keen to make sure we keep in balance.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yep.
So I've probably covered some of this already, moving at pace, lots of things happening, more things to come as well. So the government said it's going to consult on reforms to right to buy. That will look at things like reducing the discounts so that less homes are lost, which is a real big issue for councils who are building social housing and then losing it within 3 years to people who might be wanting to then buy it. So turning the tap off, if you like, on some of the loss of social housing whilst also building new. We've got legislation coming. So we've got Arab's Law, which will be taken forward through the Renters' Rights Bill. There's already provision in the Social Housing Regulation Act. And I think really importantly, one of the things that we and others have been calling for, they've said they will also produce in partnership a long-term housing strategy. And long-term means different things to different people, doesn't it? But I know from talking to officials in the department, they're talking at least 10 years. So that's at least 2 parliamentary terms, which is not easy for the way government works because they work in those 5-year cycles. Yeah. But part of the reason we are where we are is because we have had such short-term piecemeal approaches to trying to kind of stick plasters on different parts of the broken housing model. So for this to make any difference, it obviously has to be long term, and it needs to work cross-party for it to kind of have any traction. So the role of the sector in helping to develop this and then support it will be really important. And this is talking cross-tenure. This isn't just social housing. This is looking at the role of the home, in the country, and how big do we want the private rented sector to be? How big do we want the social housing? How much home ownership are we looking at? And then there's obviously different ways of, looking at what home ownership means, part buy, part rent, all of that. So that's really to come, and I think a real opportunity for us to be feeding into it. But of course, it's all about the money for any of this to be delivered at pace. Everyone's waiting to see what's going to be in the budget at the end of next month.
Yeah, definitely. And it's sort of led on to, our question of, obviously, we've seen lots of focus on homelessness as well, affordable housing supply. And, it'd be interesting to see the impact that these policies, will have on this within the next 5 years. We're, as you spoke about, at the beginning, we're seeing lots of families here in, what is classed as temporary accommodation, unable to, cook meals for themselves and their children, living out of hotel rooms, whatever it may be. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to see, the impact, that we foresee with these policies in the coming years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and on the homelessness front, government has committed in its manifesto to introducing this cross-government task force, which the Deputy Prime Minister will lead, which is really important because the departments can't do this in isolation. This has got to be sort of partnership across government too. But the reality is the new homes that we're talking about building will take a long time. The land's got to be identified, and then you've got to have the workforce to turn up and, get the spades in the ground, so to speak, and start building. So there's the immediate response to things like the homelessness crisis and the number of people in temporary accommodation and what can be done, perhaps in a slightly creative way there. Definitely working in partnership with the private rented sector to try and find homes for people to be in now, rather than just living in a hotel where you might be moving every month. And then there's the longer term, and the challenge the government's going to have, as it knows, is that you're probably looking at year 5 before you really start to see the impact of some of this stuff coming through. So there's a job to do, I think, to sort of take the country on that journey to understanding the scale of the challenge and how long it takes to move it forward. But you'd hope within 10 years you'd have a very clear trajectory, and that's why this long-term housing strategy is going to be really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yes, thanks, I've said, yeah, clarity needed on the money. So this little suitcase, whatever you'd call it, briefcase, is reflective of the picture that you always get of the Chancellor standing outside number 10 or number 11 with their red box. But everyone is waiting to see what's going to be in the budget next month. Previous governments, when they've come in, have often had an emergency budget. For whatever reason, this government hasn't done that, and that's meant the conversations in the last few months have been a bit tricky, because everyone's saying, well, we can't make any spending decisions, we have to wait for the budget. And actually, even when the budget comes out on the 30th of October, it will only be for the kind of the year ahead. But there's then a spending review which is due in the spring, which then looks at the 3-year funding cycle and effectively allocates money to different departments. So that is the real pressure point, and government is clearly signalling it wants to be very careful in how it manages the books, and it's trying to deal with the debt. One of the things that we and others have been pushing really hard on is actually it's a sort of spend to save. If you don't, as we've seen, part of the reason we've got the legacy we have is not enough money going into actually bricks and mortar building. So we're now spending huge amounts of money subsidising landlords in the private rented sector with people's housing benefit, often to subsidise a rent on a property that was originally social housing that got lost out of the system through right to buy. So it's certainly not a system you'd create if you had your time again. But yeah, we need to find the money for it to kind of make a difference. And of course, that NIMBY-YIMBY debate, which people will be familiar with, and the Labour group have set up a YIMBY group, so that not in my backyard, yes in my backyard. But that's a very binary way of presenting it. We all know also the challenges. For development to feel positive, it's got to come with the infrastructure. So we're not just talking about the homes, it's got to be everything that comes around it. It's got to be sustainable transportation, public transport. You've got to be able to get to your home. You've got to have enough schools and GPs, and make sure the roads work, so you haven't got everybody just sitting in traffic like I feel like I do most of the time when I do the school run. So clarity on the money and clarity on the infrastructure, and certainly can't talk about new homes in isolation in that sense.
I think it's really highlighting that point you made earlier around partnership, all those different factors that you've just put into that kind of ecosystem that makes this work is vast, and actually it definitely doesn't work in isolation, as you say.
So yeah, just a quick run through of some of the legislation that is coming. So the Renters' Rights Bill has now been introduced. It's what's called second reading on the 9th of October. So that's when it will have its first debate in the House of Commons. There's the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. We're still waiting for the timing on that. But this is what, for some of the things they want to do, you need legislation to basically enable it to happen. So yeah, won't spend too long on this, but just worth probably stressing again that King's Speech listed a long list of legislation, but housing was a really, really big theme in that again. So housing, very, very central to not just the announcements, because they're words, aren't they, but actually then the legislation. And hopefully that bodes well for what might be in the budget, because it's all very well for us to be talking about it, but obviously you need some funding and policy legislative framework to unlock some of the current blockages.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was thinking, you obviously have kind of highlighted the fact that this is kind of not a quick strategy, and it is a long-term strategy in terms of how they're viewing it. But in terms of how you see the new housing reforms, particularly the Renters' Rights Bill, how do you see that impacting kind of landlords and tenants? And do you think there's any kind of immediate changes in the sector that the sector should be preparing for?
Well, I suppose one thing just worth mentioning, because I'm guessing a lot of people on the call are in the sort of social housing space, that the Renters' Rights Bill tends to get thought about in the private rented sector space, which of course that's the focus, but it will end assured short hold tenancy, so it does have an impact for social housing providers and how their tenancies are set up. Although there is provision in the bill as it's been introduced to cater for where a housing association, for example, might be offering short-term supported housing, which reflects someone's current status. They might be in care leave and they need some support, but it's meant to be interim, so that then once they're able to get moving back into into kind of mainstream tenancy, they can do. So there is provision in that, because there was a risk that was raised when the Renters Reform Bill was introduced by the previous government, that ended all assured short hold tenancies without that provision in, that could have unintended consequences. And of course that's the stuff that gets thrown up as bills get debated. Government starts off with kind of, well, this is what we think we want to do, and then it's tested in the right way, and people that might know more about it than sometimes the people that have written the legislation will say, well, hang on, that's what you say you want to do, but that isn't what that's going to do, or you need to be aware it will also do this. And that's when the sort of little changes get made along the way. But otherwise I'm not aware of anything that will be massively impacting social housing providers.
Perfect.
Other than I
Thank
should
you.
say, it will help reduce the number of people that are obviously presenting needing social housing, because one of the huge drivers of homelessness and councils having to house people and then work in partnership with their housing associations if they're not stockholding is currently at the end of a private rented sector tenancy.
Yeah.
So it will have a very positive impact, I hope, in that sense.
Yeah, let's hope so.
So I guess just a summary of opportunities and challenges, and I'm an optimistic person, so try and make sure there's more on the opportunities side. I think it's really positive to see, obviously, we've got a government where housing, social housing is really, really central, recognition of just how important it is to have a safe, secure, affordable home. And when we say affordable, we're talking about no more than 30% of your net income going on housing costs, which for a lot of people is nowhere near that. So you've actually got money to do other things, and you've freed up to get to work and take the job you want to get to and all of that. The commitment to a long-term housing strategy is really positive. We've been all calling for it for a really, really long time. And I know from talking to people in government who are starting to try and make sense of that, they are keen to work in partnership. So we've got a much more open door partnership relationship now than we had previously. There is definitely a recognition of the need for investment. So there's a lot of evidence that says why it's needed and what happens if you don't do it. I think the case is made, certainly with the housing people, but it's Treasury we've got to persuade. So I think there's anything we can all do to kind of keep banging the drum, and obviously show if you can spend money here, you can save it there, or you can reap the benefits there. So an opportunity and a challenge in that one. And devolution, there's the government's committed to doing a lot in that space. Obviously, people will be familiar with the likes of Andy Burnham and Andy Street and the mayors that, although of course Andy Street lost his seat at the last election, but the mayors that have kind of grown quite a big profile and are really making things happen in their area. So government wants to see more of that, more power pushed out to the regions, where arguably, people are better placed to know what's needed in an area than the kind of ivory tower, as it's often called, of Whitehall, Westminster. But we'll see how that plays out, of course, with some of the big national stuff that government wants to do. There's always a bit of a tension in how that plays out at a local level. In terms of challenges, well, there's lots. I've put it in one bullet, but it could have been a long list. Money, obviously, we've talked about that. The things like the rent cap that social housing providers have had in the last few years. There was an interesting report from Southwark Council that lots of other councils have put their name to, that showed a 644 million loss or debt, if you like, from that rent cap. So there's a huge amount of money that basically the sector is asking government to help find in order to just almost get back to starting at zero, to even get back on an even keel, to start thinking about developing and having more money to put into looking after existing homes. And we know a lot of the homes in the country are old and leaky, and in terms of energy efficiency, and needing a lot of investment. So we have to see housing as an investment in the social sense, and not as a kind of pension fund investment. People and capacity is a massive one. I was at a round table with Chartered Institute of Building at the Labour conference, where people from across the sort of construction sector were talking about the challenges in terms of pipeline of people coming through, the ageing demographic of people working in the trades. Obviously, post Brexit, we've got a lot less people from outside of the UK working. We've got to have people to actually build the homes, and we've got to have the skills to go with that. And that isn't something that happens overnight. And however much money you throw at it, it takes time. So these are some really big challenges that the government's looking at cross-departmentally, and we've talked about the constraints on the public finances. So it's a bit like that sort of post-World War II mentality, I suppose, we're all hoping government will kick in with, of, back then, when obviously the country really didn't have much money and everything was quite broken. Out of that was birthed the National Health Service, and social housing really took on, and there was a sense of hope, but there was an investment that had to be made and sacrifices to do that. And I think we're probably back in that sort of space, so we need to see if that comes through. So I couldn't help resist the DREAM, for those that remember back to the days of Tony Blair in '97. But at the moment, there's the headline, things will get worse before they get better. I think clearly the government is recognising it perhaps needs to inject a bit more hope, so hopefully we'll start to see that. But just to give a sense of kind of the scale of the challenge, I've put Milton Keynes on there as an example of a new town, because where we're going to see some of the big numbers coming through in terms of housing supply is going to be these new towns. People will be familiar with Milton Keynes, but I was on a panel the other day where someone was saying, actually, to talk about, to just get a sense of the scale of the challenge, we're talking about building 2.5 Milton Keynes every year for the next 5+, 10+ years, just to get close to that. So it's a lot, and of course it's not going to just be the big new towns, it's going to be the incremental growth, urban extension, homes in the rural areas as well. But there's an awful lot to do to get close to it. But as Angela Rayner said when I saw her interviewed, she said, I've been underestimated all my life. I'm absolutely clear that we're going to have a very good go and do what we can to get close to these numbers. So let's wait and see. But yeah, I think it might be a bit of a bumpy road ahead.
Yeah, I think it's really positive, obviously, to see so many opportunities, and all of this focus moving forwards. Clearly, there are challenges ahead, like you've just highlighted. And I suppose, challenges such as the investment and that sort of having to work in partnership to create that full sort of ecosystem. Do you foresee housing associations and the local authorities needing any additional support or guidance? Is there anything else in place other than what's been discussed as far as investment?
I think, well, I mean, one of the things people have talked about a lot is a workforce strategy and an industrial strategy, and that goes beyond housing. But I think that is really needed, because a lot of people that work in housing will describe themselves as having fallen into it. And I know one of the things we're really keen to try and do more on as a professional body is encourage people to want to come and work in housing. And in the same way, I know the construction sector wants people to think about choosing to work there and making it a more diverse field. It's not, as they said, it's really not a very diverse demographic at the moment. So there's work to do right back in the sort of school system of encouraging people to think about some of these jobs. And of course, there's education around that in terms of the pupils and the parents and the teachers. So we've got to want to get people thinking positively about placemaking and the fantastic impact that you can have. And I think we've just got a job to do, probably, to try and stay positive, grounded but positive, because it's easy to focus in on the negatives and the challenges. But we have got a real opportunity with a government that has said at least it is committed. We've got a housing secretary who's grown up in social housing, and actually one of the MPs on one of the panels I was on the other day was saying there's this whole new generation of MPs now who've just come in at the July election who have lived the housing crisis. They have lived in temporary accommodation, in mouldy flats in the private rented sector. They've experienced it. They are the people now who are going to be pushing for this stuff, who are going to be helping to legislate for it. Some of the people that left previously, perhaps it was more, oh, my grandchildren are experiencing the challenges of high housing costs and struggling to get on the ladder. I think that will make a difference, but it's going to take time, and we just absolutely need to keep talking to each other and working in partnership, sharing good practice and constructively raising the things that are getting in the way and trying to unblock them.
Yeah, definitely agree on that.
Sorry, I'm forgetting what slides I've got now as you come on to them. So this is just a sort of summary, I suppose, of some of the things that we do at CIH. We're not like a lobby group. We're not a trade body. We're a chartered body which works in the public interest and obviously wants to work to understand and represent what our members are telling us. So we've been busy, as I said, at Party Conference talking about this stuff. We produce reports, some of which are member only, so you wouldn't be able to access them if you weren't a member, but some are open. So things like the UK Housing Review. We have an autumn briefing coming out next month, and that has a really good sort of latest data analysis of the state of the market. So that's one to look out for. Gavin's our CEO, is on the right of that picture, next to Kate Henderson of the National Housing Federation, and of course Angela Rayner. So we're in talking quite a lot to ministers and to officials, writing reports, doing research, and we are always really keen to work in partnership. So if anyone on the call is interested in doing anything with us, then you do feel free to reach out afterwards. And of course, there's going to be a mass of consultations. They've already started. We've just responded to the one on the National Planning Policy Framework, of which I saw the Housing Minister said they've had over 10,000 responses. So you've got to pity the poor civil servants who are having to wade through them. There's a lot more consultations to come, and that's going to keep us all busy. But that's our opportunity to be shaping the implementation of some of the stuff they've announced. And of course, budget, I've talked about that. So this is just a summary of the things that we've asked for. I think a lot of organisations have been putting their submissions in. Maybe not all of them are public, but this is a summary of ours, the kind of headline asks, and there's a link there if anyone wants to read it. But it reflects a lot of what we called for in our strategy for housing. So obviously investing in social housing, which government has said it will do, but in this then breaking down, well, what does that look like? How much money are we talking about? What needs to happen? And of course, it's not just housing, it's also thinking about the fabric of the building, and some of that sits with DESNES, the Energy Security Department, looking at boosting energy efficiency, and government's just announced some more funding for that this week. and then the Work and Pensions Department looking at that sort of social security safety net as it's meant to be, but in reality doesn't work as a safety net for many people. So that's one that I think might become a bit more contentious based on what I've seen the government hinting at so far. But we're really keen to make sure that local housing allowance for those that need support with their rent, for example, reflects the true cost of renting. That's a challenge at the moment with rents obviously continuing to increase. There's been a lot of negative legacy from a lack of uprating over years, which just means people's housing costs are out of reach.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go, that's my summary. I don't need to read it all, but housing is central, real opportunity, great to see things moving quickly, but a reminder that, you know, building homes takes time, and we're probably not going to see it really kicking in until the end of this 5-year term. So there's going to be some expectation management, I think, to do. We've got to obviously turn off the tap where we're losing stock whilst, you know, sorting out people getting to this place where they can actually take sensible investment decisions. It's too risky at the moment to be investing when you have limited, certainly for councils, very limited income and limited opportunity to raise money, and then not knowing what more you might have to do through things like increased regulation around decent home standard and Arab's law, competence and conduct standard, all things that are good things, but they've got to be paid for. So obviously clarity next month and in the spending review is really important. And as I've said, I think throughout, just keeping that, keeping in balance, yes, to more supply, but yes, more quality too. And we absolutely mustn't take our eye off the ball with that one.
Yeah, well, I just want to say a massive thank you to you, Rachel, because I certainly have learned a lot, especially your takeaways from the Labour Party conference as well.
Really insightful.
But just as we kind of move on to question and answers, has anyone's got any questions, please pop them in the chat. I think, have we had a few already, Joe?
We have, yeah. So James had asked, what did you make of Andy Burnham's comments this week? Councillors on housing association boards and local control of housing stock. Is this view echoed by Labour nationally?
So I saw that written up. I wasn't in the session to hear it. I think it's not something that I've heard Labour, as in like you know, Labour housing ministers say, but certainly I think that looking at how do you make sure the governance is right and it's representative, I don't personally think that necessarily has to mean it has to be a councillor, but you need to be assured that you've got the right people in terms of the skill set and the representation. And certainly when you've got more tenant voice around the table, when you're talking about making decisions that affect the people whose homes you manage, I think that is really important. And we've certainly seen the impact of when boards and, you know, senior teams haven't been as representative or as inclusive as they might be. But yeah, no, I don't think that's a sort of mainstream Labour view necessarily.
Thanks, Rachel. Alex had asked, what is the anticipated effect of the Renters' Right Bill on PRS supply? And John had responded to say that we in Kent are already experiencing landlords, particularly small landlords, exiting the market. So no doubt there will be a significant rise in homelessness in the short term before they experience the benefits of the reforms.
I think that's a really challenging one, isn't it? Because I mean, I heard Matthew Pennicott, the housing minister, ask for his thoughts, because that's the thing that obviously the private rented sector landlord sort of lobby have said for a long time. If you tighten up the regulation, people are going to exit. Certainly his view when asked was to say, well, I don't think the data supports that, although anecdotally I'm hearing a lot of people saying, well, we're seeing it. So it will be interesting to see what data and how up to date it is. But as he said, of course, the properties don't exist. The ownership of them might change, but the property is still there. So I know that I think that back to that point around partnership, there is certainly an opportunity that I guess to turn that challenge around, looking at, well, how could social housing providers be supported? And this comes back to the sort of financial support and incentives to look at buying back properties where that might be the right thing to do. I know that has challenges as well, but there could be scope to bring some back in, of course, that may have started off in the social housing space, moved out to private, and organisations like Capital Letters do some really interesting work looking at how they can work in partnership to support private landlords to stay, particularly where it's with lower income tenants, where the funding is less certain. And I know people are nervous because the court reform does need to, whilst this government has said it won't tie the ending of Section 21 in with court reform, clearly that issue is still there, and that's a Ministry of Justice issue, but they need to sort out the backlog, because understandably landlords are concerned, well, if I can't get my property back and the tenant hasn't paid fees and it's got to go through the system, but that takes time. I can't afford it. But my sense is, from hearing ministers and MPs on different panels, is that they would perhaps like to see, and we'll see if it's reflected in the housing strategy, but they would like to see a move to more kind of larger private rented sector landlords, more institutional investment, rather than what we currently have is often quite accidental landlords, and you've got people with smaller portfolios and not necessarily not as easy for them to perhaps respond to all the new regulation coming down the track. So I think we will probably see a shift in what your average landlord portfolio is, but I think it is inevitable that it's going to feel a bit painful before, as we follow that transition through. And I think a lot's going to depend on the budget. I keep saying that, don't know, that's my takeaway from today. But in terms of, there's lots of speculation around changing rules around capital gains tax, and people I know are nervous around, well, do I need to quickly sell up now because I'm worried it's going to impact if I try and sell a bit later. So I hope government will do a bit more to just assure, because we absolutely need the private rented sector, and it isn't going to help anyone in the long run if suddenly lots of people are getting Section 21 notices because the landlord wants to sell up, unless we've got new people ready to come in and take them up.
Thanks, Rachel. We have had a couple of other questions and comments in the chat, but I do appreciate that have ran over the session and everybody's probably got places to be and things to do. So I think we'll wrap it up here, if you agree, Liv.
Yeah, we can always follow up on those additional
absolutely.
questions if we just make a note of them, please. Again, a big thank you to Rachel for joining us today and providing her kind of expert insight. Our next Housing Hive is on the 24th of October at 11 o'clock, and it's focusing on AI in housing and unlocking innovation and enhancing services. So I just want to thank everyone for joining today, and if you do have any other questions that you want to follow up with, then we'd be more than happy to hear from you. So thank you all for joining, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.